Now that we've looked at seedless vascular plants and how the vascular system has helped plants move away from water environments and enter into much drier environments, we can turn our attention to the next step. This step is the gymnosperms, and gymnosperms are important because they are the first plants that we see with seeds. If we take a quick look at our plant phylogeny, we're about halfway through this list on the left-hand side here. Our next step is to look at the seeded vascular plants, and we're first going to take a look at the gymnosperms. Of our seeded plants, we have gymnosperms and angiosperms. Gymnosperms split off from our seedless vascular plants by revolutionizing the plant world with seeds. Along with seeds, we get ovules, which are essentially the equivalent of an egg in a plant, pollen, and wood. So our gymnosperms actually branched off from a now extinct vascular plant line that had woody stems. So many of our seed plants have wood stems as well, and those that don't have lost that characteristic. Looking a little more specifically at our seed plants, we are going to look very briefly at cycads, ginkgo, and conifers. These are our three categories of gymnosperms. And then in our next lecture, we're going to look at our angiosperms. And angiosperms are our flowering plants. You can see here on the right, all of these plants have flowers. And they have their own really fascinating characteristics that allow them to do really well on land. Both our seed vascular plants, gymnosperms and angiosperms, have done fabulously, and that is thanks to the development of seeds and pollen, which are both able to withstand drying out in much drier terrestrial environments than our seedless vascular plants and our mosses before that. Collectively, our gymnosperms and angiosperms are called spermatophytes. Spermatophyte is really just a fancy word to say seed plant. Both of these types of plants have this structure, the seed structure. The seed structure is a protective enclosure for the embryo. So once the sperm fertilizes the ovule in a seed plant, it grows into a tiny embryo that is protected by an outer membrane called a seed coat. A seed coat is going to help keep that embryo from drying out until it lands on the soil with the proper conditions to germinate. Very much like an egg, a seed contains energy. So inside an egg, think of a chicken egg, you have the proteins and the carbohydrates and the lipids that are going to feed that baby chicken. Well, a seed is essentially the same thing. It has a storage area for carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins. And just like an egg, those carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins found in this structure called the endosperm around the embryo is going to help nourish that little tiny plant once it lands. So it is basically an enclosed structure that has this little embryo with everything that it needs to grow into a mature plant once it lands and germinates. Our modern seed plants also have pollen. Pollen are little tiny spores that contain the microscopic male gametophyte. In just a few minutes, we'll talk about the alternation of generations, but one of the keys here is that remembering that spores will grow into the gametophyte. When we get to our seed plants, the gametophyte is actually contained fully within the spore. So we're following our trend of that gametophyte getting smaller and smaller. And so the spore contains that male gametophyte, and we call that spore with the male gametophyte pollen. Up in the top right corner, we have some pine pollen. We looked at this in our plant lab. We can see the little wings. That's going to help it carry through the air because our conifers our gymnosperms, which contain conifers, are going to have wind dispersed pollen. Once we get to angiosperms, we are going to have animal dispersed or insect dispersed, things like that. In the center here, we've got colorized electron microscope image of pollen. You can see it's got this rough outer structure. That's just to help it to stick to things. Since we're kind of talking about both angiosperms and gymnosperms now, you've got this bee down at the bottom, and you can see that pollen is stuck to little tiny hairs on the side of the bee. That is because it's basically kind of like Velcro sticking to the hairs on the bee. We've got this structure on the outside that's going to help it be sticky. The evolution of seeds in pollen was really important because it helped to deal with some of the problems that our seedless plants have, which was limitations to reproduction because they were so tied to water. The plants were generally found in really damp environments so that the flagellated sperm of those plants could get to the egg. Once we evolve pollen, this allows the plant to disperse its gametophyte even in dry environments by wind or by other animals. And then, of course, we have that protective seed that is going to allow it to also mature even though it is away from water. Seed plants began to dominate during the Carboniferous period. The Carboniferous period spans from about 350 to 290 million years ago. Prior to this, the dominant plants were our seedless vascular plants, so you can think of ferns and whatnot. This image here from our textbook shows really, really large seedless vascular plants, basically giant ferns here. These evolved in a time that was very warm, very damp. There was a lot of carbon dioxide in the air. Carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, which means that as there's more carbon dioxide, it warms up the atmosphere. Because there were so many vascular plants during the Carboniferous, they began to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and release oxygen. During this time, oxygen began to rise, and it began to rise really, really high. It got to some of the highest values that we've seen. Once the seed plants became dominant, the atmosphere began to cool a bit. We have less carbon dioxide, more oxygen, and along with the cooling, habitats became drier. This was going to be perfect for seed plants, and we see at the Carboniferous that those the seedless vascular plants begin to sort of get ushered out and make way for the seed plants. And after the Carboniferous, our seed plants are really going to dominate the landscape up until current time. One of the defining features of our seed plants is the presence of wood. So it appears that gymnosperms have an ancestor in the seedless plants that produced wood. Wood is a special material that, in addition to the vascular system, is going to give plants a really strong, sturdy tissue. It is composed of basically rings of xylem tissue, and remember that xylem is extra strong, helps provide that structure. And so by having more xylem tissue, this is going to allow the plant to grow much higher. So if you think about some of our huge oak trees and our hickory trees and our beech trees, our maple trees in this area, some of them grow to be really, really tall, and that's partly due to wood. If you think about some of our non-woody plants, like our grasses, they're not growing nearly as tall, and that's partly because of the lack of wood. The advantage for being tall is that it allows plants to capture sunlight for photosynthesis. So the higher you are, the better chance you have of getting all that wonderful sunlight. And then, of course, the lower you are, the more likely something is going to grow up over you. So wood was really advantageous because it allowed plants to sort of reach up higher over some of the smaller plants around them. There are three major groups within the modern seed plants. There are several lineages of gymnosperms that became extinct, including the potential most closely related group to the angiosperms. It's a little unclear which group is most closely related, and it may be because there's a lineage that has since become extinct that was a gymnosperm that led into that angiosperm lineage. But there are currently three major groups: the cycads, the ginkgos, and the conifers. The word gymnosperm means naked seed. So when we say naked seed, we mean a seed that is not enclosed within fruits. When we get to the angiosperms, we're going to see seeds that are enclosed in flowers and then in fruits. And so the distinction there in the name is the gymnosperm, meaning naked seeds or not covered with fruit. So we have three gymnosperm groups. We've got the cycads, the ginkgos, and the conifers. Cycads are considered the earliest diverging phylum of the gymnosperms. There are about 300 species today. Most of them are native to tropical and subtropical regions, although they are found in North America as ornamentals. Some of them are really pretty. They're characterized by these palm-shaped leaves. These images on the top are all from the Missouri Botanical Garden. These examples are either in the tropical climatron or in the arid house. Cycads have these cone-like structures that either produce pollen or they produce eggs. And these cone-like structures emit odors that attract beetles. Most of our pollination is going to occur in the angiosperms. In the gymnosperms, generally, they're going to be wind pollinated, but there are some examples like beetles that can pollinate the cycads. Our second group, ginkgo, has only one living example of, or I should say one living species example, and that is the ginkgo biloba. The ginkgo biloba used to be much more diverse. During the age of the dinosaurs, they were much more diverse, but are now nearly extinct in the wild. Most of the ginkgo biloba that we find are going to be planted as ornamentals. They're very popular along city streets because they have these really big fan-shaped bright green leaves, and they're very hardy. They're cold tolerant, heat tolerant, pollution tolerant. But there's only this one type left. There is an example of a ginkgo biloba in O'Fallon Community Park. If you walk around their walking path, many of their trees are labeled, and one of them happens to be the ginkgo biloba. Our last group is the conifers. Of our gymnosperms, this is the group that you are probably most familiar with. We don't have a ton of conifers in this area, but in North America in general, we do have a lot of conifers. Conifers are very nicely adapted to colder, drier environments. We'll talk about why in just a few minutes. Many conifers are economically important. They're used a lot for wood and for making paper. They have these big fancy cones that protect the seeds. So the seeds are kind of tucked away down inside this female cone here, and to release the seed, the cone has to open up. So the cone opens up. They usually have winged seeds, so the wings of the seeds will get picked up by the wind and blown somewhere else to germinate. They usually have a male and a female cone. We can see that on this image on the left. We've got the tiny male strobilus cone, and up Over here, we've got the larger female cone. The female cone is going to be the one that is going to carry the seeds. As I mentioned, they're more common in mountains, colder latitudes, higher latitudes, and they have several adaptations that allow them to thrive in cold climates. Conifers are well adapted to colder, drier environments, and that's mostly thanks to their leaves. They have needle-shaped leaves that have a waxy cuticle. Now, waxy cuticle is not unique to conifers. We see waxy cuticles on a lot of plants because that's going to help with water loss. But the long, thin shape of the needle leaf is going to do a couple of things. It's going to sort of reduce some of the area through which water can be lost. It's also going to reduce the area that could see damage due to cold. And the reason that this is important is that conifers do not drop their leaves. So in the Midwest, most of our trees are deciduous, which means they drop their leaves in the fall and regrow their leaves in the spring. Conifers don't do that. And so to also reduce the potential for damage due to cold, they have these long, thin leaves. Also, the needle-shaped leaves are better for holding snow so that the branches don't break. They don't become quite as heavy because they're not such a wide surface area to hold the leaves. Retaining leaves through the winter helps conifers start photosynthesis earlier in the year, so they don't have to spend time growing their leaves. As soon as sunlight becomes more and more frequent, they can start photosynthesis. They don't have to wait for the plant to respond to those light cues. They just already have their leaves there. And this is an advantage because in the more northern climates, their growing season is much shorter. As we get farther north, the summer is shorter. The summer's not shorter, but the days are shorter, less sunlight, less intense sunlight. And so they need to be able to do as much photosynthesis as they can when the sun is most available. There's one other subgroup that we're going to talk about here. This is the order Natalis. These are a group, 3 different genus, the genus Needham, the genus Ephedra, and the genus Welwitschia. These are some super unique conifers. I'm just going to leave them here for you to look at them. I'm not going to test on these guys, but I just wanted to share them because they're kind of interesting and super unique to the areas that they come from. Our pine alternation of generations is going to be a little bit different than our seedless vascular plant because of the addition of the seed. Also, we have a few new characteristics here. We have a megaspore, which is produced within the megasporangium. Basically, that megaspore is going to become the seed in our seed plants. The general process of the pine life cycle is the same as we've seen in moss, the same as we've seen in ferns, but we are continuing our 2 trends. One is that the sporophyte is getting bigger, and the second is that the gametophyte is getting smaller. So if we start with our seed growing into a mature plant, that's our sporophyte. Remember, our sporophyte is going to produce our spores. If we go along the right to the pollen cone is going to produce the pollen, which is a spore that contains the male gametophyte. So if we follow along here, we've got our cone. Mitosis happens to produce our spores. Remember that our spores are the structure that contains the gametophyte once we get to our seed plants. Up on the top here where we have our female cone, that female cone is going to have a structure called a megaspore. That megaspore is inside the scale of the cone, and that megaspore is essentially a the megaspore is contained within the megasporangium. So the only difference here is that the sporangium is getting bigger, so we call it the megasporangium. And inside that spore is going to be the gametophyte. So again, this is a little bit different. In our moss, the spore grew into the gametophyte, but in our seed plants, the gametophyte is contained within the megaspore. So if we look over here, we've got our egg inside that megaspore structure. The pollen is going to land at the opening of that megaspore. The structure on the outside is called the integument. You don't have to know that, but just to give it a name, the pollen lands on the opening of the integument. Then that pollen is going to germinate. We can see here the pollen has landed there on the opening to the integument, and then we've got the pollen tube growing from the pollen, penetrating through the outside layers of that megasporangium into the egg. Here we've got the pollen tube. You can see it's pointing out the sperm that is going to fertilize that egg, and then that egg is going to grow into the embryo. That embryo is going to become the seed. Remember, this is all happening inside those scales because that's where the megasporangium is. And then we've got the seed here that has grown out of that embryo. So just a really quick review. We've got our seed that grows into the sporophyte. That sporophyte is either going to be the male or the female. Remember that the megaspore contains the is contained within the sporangium, and that is going to contain the megaspore, which is the egg. The pollen is going to fertilize the megaspore and produce the embryo. Inside the pollen cone, we have the pollen or the spores. They are called the microspores. They're really, really tiny. The megaspore is much, much larger inside that female cone. And if you remember from the previous image and also from our plant lab, the female cones are usually much bigger. The male cones are usually much smaller.